We've got to have that courage. We've got to have the same courage that our forefathers had, and that our parents had, and that many of you have had and exhibited in another way. We must have that courage. We must make whatever sacrifice is necessary for the sake of future generations, because that's what we're about. And for the sake of the past generations. I loved what Libby said about knowing that she lives here now, and that there's those before her, and that those will come after, and it's a constant struggle. We must do our part. I often think about what a selfish generation I grew up in. And I think I did. I think my parents worked very hard. They came up through the Depression and World War II to give me a good world, a good life. Seems as though my generation, for the most part, has said, well, you know, helping my children has given them a good education and making sure they find a good spouse and helping them find a good spouse and have good kids, and those kids get a good education. We get good TV and a good car and a good home. Well, we never thought about, what about the rest of the world? What about that community? For my grandfather, the community was a small town in New Hampshire, and if he could take care of that area, that was it. Today, the community is this planet, and we must take care of it. We must move forward with it. So each and every one of us has something incredible to contribute. And as I look at you who are in my generation or older, and I'd say my generation is the 30s and older. I don't know that I wish that anymore, you know. Anyway, we older folks, we truly are the elders. We've got so much to do. Most of us don't have bosses anymore, so we can't be fired. You know, what do we get to lose? We really must go out there and work with you younger folks, and you too must have the courage and be willing to make the sacrifices. But it is our time, we elders, to really lead the way. You guys are all here. Let's get rid of this president, and let's get rid of everybody that thinks like him. Let's end that war in Iraq, but let's also go out and change the corporatocracy. Yeah, well, the corporatocracy runs our government. There's no question about it. That's why I was saying that getting rid of George Bush isn't going to solve the long-term problem. It could solve some short-term problems. It's a good idea, but we must change the corporatocracy because they control our government more than any other. And yes, PUCA is a good example, getting rid of that. So many things, getting rid of Medicare, you know, trying to get rid of Medicare and Social Security and all the things they're doing to undermine us. In fact, a lot of economic hitman techniques that have been very successful overseas are now being brought home to work against us here in this country. Our middle class is on the decline just as it is in so many other places. So yes, the corporatocracy runs this country. Make no doubt about it. Have no doubt about it. And if we want to change this country, we're going to have to go after the corporatocracy. Thank you.
So I just wanted to follow on that in terms of the corporatocracy. I was just wondering if it were worth it to push the envelope a little bit more, even past that. I mean, you built up the corporatocracy as the greatest enemy, but it almost seems to me that even if we would strike and win some battles against, let's say, for example, Walmart, and be able to break apart Walmart, make it a little bit more democratic. In this system, in the economic system, which you say that perhaps we're able to create a democratic capitalism, I would almost argue that capitalism itself seems to be inherently undemocratic in that there is a fundamental concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. And that even if we would knock down the 6 or 7 or 10 major corporations, others would take its place, because that's how capitalism runs in terms of putting profit before people. Corporations are legally required to put profit before people and to make a profit. And so my question really is that why would we, instead of battling individual corporations, because it's not the human beings in the corporations, it's the system of capitalism itself that is inherently unjust and unequal. And so instead of demoralizing ourselves and keep pushing individual corporations, why don't we change the system itself? We created it. I think we have the power to change the system to be humane and just and fair. So that's
well, first of all, there is nothing. There is no such law. There's no law that says corporations have to make a profit. There's no law that says they have to maximize it. If there were, the chief executive officers would not be able to pay themselves 300 or 400 times more than their average employees, because that's not maximizing profits. And whenever people like Rainforest Action Network or Amnesty International or others go after corporations, they change their policies. There is a conception in this country that legally corporations are bound to maximize profits. There is no such law. It is entirely up to the management of the corporations, and sometimes with stockholder approval, but for many things they don't need that, to make policy for the corporations. I have studied capitalism all my life. I see everything in it that's inherently democratic, but it's not being employed that way. If you take the basics of capitalism, it can be a very, very democratic institution. It has not been done that way. And from a very practical standpoint, I don't see us overthrowing capitalism. I don't see the corporations as our enemies, as this young woman portrayed them. That's what I'm trying to say, is even the people within the corporations desperately want to see change. Most of them want to see a better world. There may be pathological personalities running our corporations, but they're few and far between, probably something sort of similar to the percentage in our population as a whole. Most CEOs, and I've known a lot of them, want a better world. So I think our best shot is not to think that we can overthrow the whole system, but to think that we can reform the system and change the system.
Would you expand upon the situation of oil in Ecuador in light of Joe Kane's book, Savages, in which he describes how U.S. oil interests have essentially destroyed native communities and the Ecuadorian rainforest near the headwaters of the Amazon without much protest in the U.S. Much of that oil physically comes to California. Californians are much more concerned about drilling off the shore of California than they are about the destruction of the ecosystem in Ecuador. And that's not corporations that are protesting offshore drilling of California. That's mainstream Californians. And also, in light of peak oil, do you believe that peak oil is an oil company conspiracy?
That's a lot of questions. Joe Kane wrote about the Guarani in Ecuador, and I'm very familiar with the Guarani. I've worked a lot with the Shuar, who are their neighbors. That's where I have some godchildren. And yes, the oil companies have destroyed the Guarani culture, in essence, as well as all those lands in that area. And I've seen it done since I lived there in 68, starting in 68. I've seen it happen over these last 40 years or so. It's been terrible. And you're absolutely right. You know, the California Bee a few years ago had a huge supplement in the newspaper that said, it basically made the point that California was destroying, were the worst environmentalists on the planet, but they just didn't shit in their own backyard, basically. You know, they did it in everybody else's and destroyed everybody else's rainforests and so on, rather than polluting themselves to get their oil. And that can basically be said pretty much for this entire country to a very large degree. We need to change that. You know, I personally think if we're going to consume all this oil, we ought to be polluting our own soils first, if that's what it takes. And you know, I hate to say that in a way, but the other side of that is when we drill for oil here, despite all the terrible tragedies that happen in Alaska and elsewhere, we do take a lot more precautions than we do when we do it in other countries. And I can't remember the rest of your question.
Do you believe that
peak oil.
Peak oil is an oil company conspiracy?